Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here on a drizzly day. I understand so many people have come from California and elsewhere, so welcome. I'm very pleased to be here with this distinguished panel. I am Allan Gerson. Some of you may know me as an international lawyer, as a person who served as counsel to the U.S. delegation to the UN and spent a lot of time there. And I have written in the past about obligations, which is the title of our conference today. The obligations of the UN, the obligations of the United States to avert a humanitarian crisis, which is a very euphemistic phrase. It's much more than a humanitarian crisis. It's about avoiding death, slaughter, and I say this as a former Justice Department official and State Department official. We are dedicated to the rule of law. It is the United States that instituted Nuremberg proceedings, which was the precursor of everything that we know about in terms of international criminal responsibility. And yet what we see today is an abdication from that responsibility, because the first requirement of the rule of law is the equal application of the law. And you cannot have the equal application unless you specify standards. And we have a situation in which the U.S. Court of Appeals has asked the State Department, chided the State Department, coaxed it in the gentlest terms to tell us what are the standards for keeping people on this list of terrorist organization, because the consequences are called hysteria. Not hysteria on the part of the people at Ashraf, but certainly hysteria on the part of the people that are there to ostensibly protect them, the government of Iraq. And that, I am ashamed to say, is what we have seen from the State Department. We have seen incredible passivity in light of the impending humanitarian disaster. We have good news now. Good news because it's a cloud of hope on the horizon, because the UN has chosen just recently, and we'll talk about this in our various panel discussions, to state unequivocally that the people of Ashraf are entitled to political asylum, and that they cannot be kept there, penned up the way the government of Iraq would like. Fortunately, the United Nations has seen fit to step in. But stepping in does not mean tiptoeing in. Stepping in means taking firm measures on the ground so that the people that are there are in fact protected, so that we are not talking about words, but we are talking about actions. Because the use of the word obligations, which is the title of our talk today, is a very important word. And obligations entail not simply things that are written in fancy prose, but the requirement that individuals take concrete action. So we're going to talk about today with our distinguished panelists about what are the obligations that are incumbent.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. As I left New York this morning, you could see the motorcades of foreign diplomats beginning to descend on the city. They began to arrive earlier this week for the United Nations General Assembly. And soon enough, far too soon for most of us, one of those motorcades will be the one conveying Mahmoud Ahmadinejad into the heart of a city of people of diverse background and creative energy, a diversity and an energy that he despises to his core. Where's the hope? Well, can we find it in the Arab, what has been described as the Arab Spring, in the forces sweeping the Middle East? Well, the sad fact is that that movement has begun to succeed only in authoritarian countries, not in totalitarian countries. In other words, it's begun to succeed only in countries where there is some limit to the brutality that the regime is able and willing to bring to bear. on dissent. But in countries where there is no limit to the brutality that the regime would use to put down dissent, and Iran tops the list of those countries, the story has not been as happy. Back in February, when Egyptians were first beginning to stir, at Friday prayers in Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, speaking not in Farsi, but in Arabic, to make sure he reached and impressed people in Cairo, he claimed that events in Tahrir Square were the natural extension of the 1979 revolution in Iran. He was obviously not embarrassed that in 2009, he himself had given the orders to put down the uprising in the streets of Tehran that actually began the Arab Spring. And then again, that the regime has responded with brute force. Even before Iranians went into the street, the mullahs executed people in record numbers and called for the execution of anyone who dissents. And when people were nonetheless brave enough to take to the streets again, the regime cut the ties between the protesters and the outside world so that it could use brutality without being seen. And in particular, as I'm sure many of you in this room know better than I, the mullahs have executed people with a connection to Camp Ashraf, where MEK residents are holding out, despite the efforts of Iran and its collaborators among the Iraqi authorities to drive the residents back to Iran or to destroy them altogether. I've been before you on earlier occasions, and we have heard many people anxiously long for and look for signs that this country, the United States, so despised by Ahmadinejad and the mullahs in Tehran, would bestir itself and take concrete action to do what Ahmadinejad and those who pull his strings most oppose and fear, and that is to remove the MEK from the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations. Those hopes so far have not been realized, and it seems ironic to have to report this morning, as Allan Gerson did, that the main hope for the people of Ashraf as we sit here is that the United Nations, an organization that has not exactly covered itself with glory over the years, will act through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, at least to help the residents of Ashraf get the benefit of a guarantee that was given to them by a United States general in 2003, that they would have the status of protected persons under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The history here is known to many, but nonetheless bears repeating. In the 1990s, as a goodwill gesture to the regime in Tehran, our government placed the MEK on that list. By all accounts, this was done to help us engage with the regime and perhaps to get the regime to behave as a responsible member of the world community. Whether that policy was wise or foolish, there's no mistaking that it failed. Repeatedly, the Iranian regime has grown only more hostile and more threatening toward the United States and toward its neighbors. In the administration in which I served, that designation was continued, this time out of fear that if the MEK were delisted, the Iranians would provide weapons, including deadly IEDs, to insurgents in Iraq. Well, that policy too was a failure because, as we know, although the designation continued, Iran has supplied deadly weapons, including IEDs, to those insurgents. Where do we stand today? Well, in Camp Ashraf, the organization that surrendered its arms and placed itself under the international protection in 2003 to the point where the residents of Ashraf each received an identification card issued by the United States, designating that person as a protected person. That camp has been attacked twice by Iraqi troops. Once in July of 2009 and once in April of 2011, and both times when the Secretary of Defense of the United States was present in Iraq. The last time resulting in the murder of 35 defenseless women and men using weapons and vehicles supplied by the United States and operated by troops trained by the United States. And the United States has done nothing about it. In fact, although the attack came from Iraqi troops who were photographed in the act of committing it, some in the State Department have actually advocated resettling Ashraf residents elsewhere in Iraq, away from the Iranian border, as if the attack somehow had come from Iran, a sure way of making certain that the remaining residents of Ashraf can be obliterated completely out of the sight of the rest of the world. As I said, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has made it explicit a few days ago that the residents of Ashraf who have filed applications for refugee status are entitled to that status. But what about the United States? What about the country that Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, called the last best hope of earth? What has the United States done? Now the European Union and the United Kingdom have acted forcefully to remove the terrorist designation from the MEK years ago, recognizing that if that designation ever was appropriate, and I submit to you that there is substantial reason to doubt that it ever was appropriate, but if it ever was, the record is clear that there is no such basis any longer. In order to be kept on that list, an organization must be involved in terrorism at some point in the last 10 years. That's the law. As I indicated, the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit has made it clear that the government has shown no evidence to justify that designation. The court told the State Department that its evidence was not adequate and remanded the matter to the State Department to present other evidence, if it could, to justify the continued designation. And the State Department has been at this for a year. It has asked MEK written questions having nothing whatsoever to do with the appropriateness of the designation, and presented all kinds of irrelevant documents, and has simply dragged its feet and refused to act. Let's take one example that I think lifts the lid off what's going on here. An unclassified State Department document reporting that when State Department officials questioned Iranians applying for visas to enter the United States from such places as Ankara, Baku, Berlin, Dubai, and Istanbul, these visa applicants reported that they regarded MEK unfavorably. Now think about that. First of all, whether these Iranians think well or ill of MEK is not relevant to whether MEK should be listed as a foreign terrorist organization. But beyond that, the State Department is actually claiming with a straight face that when it lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization and then asks people applying for visas from the State Department what they think of MEK, the people they ask who are applying for visas to the country that lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization say they have unfavorable views of MEK. A first-year college student who offered that kind of evidence to support a conclusion in a term paper would get a failing grade. This is a strategy of nothing but endless delay. Repeated requests from people on both sides of the political spectrum. Former governors Howard Dean of Vermont and Bill Richardson of New Mexico, both Democrats. Former Ambassador John Bolton, who's here, and former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Former Homeland Security Director Tom Ridge. Two former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have all called on the United States, implored our government to end this unjustified designation. So what can the Secretary do as Mahmoud Ahmadinejad prepares to come to New York and stage his annual obscene performance at the United Nations? Well, she can do what the European Union has already done, what the United Kingdom has already done, and remove this evil designation. And she can do it as a splendid welcome to Ahmadinejad as he comes to New York to spit in the collective face of humanity. This is a great opportunity to change the dynamic that has prevailed until now, and to do so dramatically. It would have two effects. First, it would show the current regime that we mean business and that we are prepared to take all necessary steps to bring pressure on the regime. And secondly, it would take the focus of the regime away from interfering with the Arab Spring, as it has been, through Hezbollah and its other surrogates, and away from the situation in Egypt. What we can do is to stop just being a great power and start behaving like a great power, and to show that the words of Abraham Lincoln, who described the United States as the last best hope of earth, are, as they are in fact, even truer today than they were when he first spoke them. Thank you very much.